On the morning of March 14, 1941, at precisely 7:42 a.m., Beatrice Tilly Shilling stood beside the runway at RAF Kenley. She watched a Hurricane pilot climb into his aircraft, fully aware that this flight could easily be his last. At 32 years old, after 6 years working at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, she still hadn't delivered a solution to the flaw that was costing pilots their lives. During that week alone, the Luftwaffe had sent 43 Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters across the Channel. RAF squadrons had clashed with them in 27 separate dogfights. 14 Hurricanes and 9 Spitfires had been lost. The pattern was painfully familiar. A British pilot spotted a German fighter, pushed the stick forward into a dive to engage, and suddenly his engine quit. The Bf-109 either escaped without damage, or even worse, looped back around and shredded the powerless British fighter while the pilot frantically worked to restart his Merlin engine. Shilling had examined the combat reports. She had gone through maintenance documentation and personally interviewed the lucky pilots who survived such failures. The issue was well understood. The carburetor flooded any time the aircraft was pushed into -G. Gravity reversed the fuel flow in the float chamber, the jets momentarily starved, and the engine cut out. That brief power loss, just 1.5 seconds, gave a Messerschmitt all the time it needed. In that moment, a Bf-109 could close 300 yards and open fire. Meanwhile, German engines suffered no such weakness. Their Daimler-Benz power plants relied on direct fuel injection, completely eliminating float chamber flooding. Messerschmitt pilots were free to dive, roll, climb, or invert without losing a fraction of power. The advantage was decisive. British pilots knew it. German pilots depended on it. Squadron leaders reported it constantly, and RAF combat strength was eroding faster than new pilots could be trained. For nearly a year, Shilling had been devoted to solving the issue. Engineers at Rolls-Royce were developing a pressure carburetor, a long-term fix that would completely overhaul fuel delivery, but that upgrade wouldn't be ready until 1943 or even 1944. The war was moving too fast. Every day, pilots strapped into Spitfires and Hurricanes, aware that their engine might kill them before the enemy did. Squadron leader Davies walked past Shilling toward his Hurricane. At just 24 years old, he had flown 41 missions and earned 3 confirmed victories. He had already experienced 2 engine failures and dives within the last month, narrowly surviving both through sheer luck and thousands of hours of training. He gave Shilling a nod, unaware that she was the carburetor expert from Farnborough. To him, she probably looked like office staff, someone's assistant. But in her motorcycle satchel, Shilling carried the answer she believed could stop the losses: a small, precisely machined brass restrictor plate. Her team had spent 6 weeks testing it on a bench-mounted Merlin engine. It worked. But everything was different in combat. 300-mile-per-hour dives, pilots crushed into their harnesses by -G, and life-or-death decisions resolved in seconds. If her device failed in the air, it wouldn't just endanger the pilot, it could end her career. The root of the problem went back to July 1940, when the RAF switched to 100-octane fuel. The boost increase allowed the Merlin to produce 1,310 horsepower instead of 1,100, making the Spitfire Mark II fast enough, 370 miles per hour in level flight, to chase down the Bf-109. But the Skinner's Union carburetor couldn't cope with the inverted and -G maneuvering of high-intensity aerial combat. Shilling knew carburetors better than anyone in the engine department. She joined the Royal Aircraft Establishment 1 month after Britain entered the war. Out of everyone in the unit, only 2 were women, and the other one was a secretary. Many of the male engineers doubted that a woman could contribute anything meaningful to mechanical design. Shilling never bothered arguing. Her focus was singular: saving pilots' lives. She had been building engines since childhood. At 14, she bought herself a Norton motorcycle, disassembled the 2-stroke engine piece by piece, studied how every component worked, and then rebuilt it.
By 25, she raced that same Norton at Brooklands, achieving a 106-mile-per-hour average lap speed and earning the British Motorcycle Racing Club's Gold Star, a distinction only a handful of women had ever achieved. Racing taught her exactly how engines behaved under extreme stress, high G turns, violent acceleration, and abrupt changes in attitude. She developed an intuition for fuel flow that instruments couldn't measure. That instinct finally led her to the idea she was carrying onto the airfield. The carburetor only flooded because fuel could surge freely when gravity reversed. So what if the fuel flow was limited, not shut off, but restrained? The engine would still receive enough fuel to operate under all normal conditions, but not so much that it would overflow. Her prototype was a tiny brass disc with a precisely calibrated hole through the center. Placed in the line before the carburetor, it limited the maximum fuel flow to just below what the engine demanded at full throttle. Shilling machined the first version herself, a small brass thimble, 0.125 inches across, with a central aperture measuring 0.04 inches. Every dimension was critical. If the hole was too wide, flooding remained a threat. Too narrow, and the engine would starve. 17 variations were tested before she found the correct size. Then she simplified the shape to a flat washer, easier to manufacture, install, and replace. The bench tests had been encouraging. The restrictor prevented fuel flooding during simulated negative G dives. But laboratory results weren't enough. It had to work in a real aircraft during real combat, and for that, she needed official approval.
Installing unauthorized modifications on RAF fighters was a direct violation of numerous regulations, dozens of them, in fact. If her restrictor failed in battle and a pilot was killed, Shilling would face a court-martial and potentially prison. She chose to bypass official permission entirely and rely on asking forgiveness later. That morning, at Kenley, she carried 6 restrictors in her satchel and had enlisted the help of a cooperative ground crew sergeant who owed her a favor. Sergeant William Cooper had been servicing Merlin engines for 3 years. He had personally witnessed 19 pilot deaths caused by mid-combat engine failures. When Shilling showed him the little brass washer, he didn't hesitate or question her. He simply retrieved his tools. The Hurricane sat fueled and ready on the dispersal pad. The pilot was already aboard, the engine warming, with 20 minutes to go before takeoff. Cooper moved quickly, disconnecting the fuel line between pump and carburetor. The restrictor slipped neatly into position. A quick weld with a small butane torch secured it. The entire operation took barely a minute, and the alteration was invisible unless someone knew exactly where to look. Shilling inspected the weld, smooth and clean, perfectly done. Squadron Leader Davies was now flying with the restrictor installed, unaware of its presence. Shilling had informed no one except Cooper, not the maintenance chief, not the squadron commander, no one. If the restrictor failed and Davies crashed into the channel, there would be no authorization paperwork, no official test results, just a dead pilot and a forbidden brass washer. Davies pushed his Merlin engine to full power. A growling roar filled the air as he completed pre-flight checks. Oil pressure steady, coolant temperature nominal, magnetos firing properly across all 12 cylinders. He released the brakes and accelerated down the runway, lifting into the morning sky. Shilling followed the climb through binoculars. 800 feet, 1,200, then 2,000. Soon the Hurricane veered south toward the channel. 2 more Hurricanes joined Davies, forming a 3-ship patrol. The week had seen frequent German fighter activity near Dungeness. If they encountered Bf-109s, Davies would need to push into a dive, and only then would they learn whether her restrictor actually worked. Shilling remained motionless on the tarmac beside Cooper, neither of them willing to break the silence. Life on the airfield continued. Trucks rumbled, mechanics barked instructions, tools clattered, ordinary sounds of a fighter station at war. But she could only think about fuel flow, orifice diameter, pressure drop, and those critical 1.5 seconds of negative G. The calculations were sound, but calculations did not always survive combat. 40 minutes passed, then an hour. No radio reports came from Davies' section. Silence could mean they met no enemy aircraft, or that the fight had been so intense they were too busy to transmit, or that Davies was gone, his aircraft shattered somewhere in France. Finally, at 9:37, the radio crackled to life. 3 Hurricanes returning, 2 minutes out. Shilling lifted her binoculars and spotted the silhouettes, 3 aircraft, all intact. Davies touched down first and taxied to the dispersal area. He killed the engine and climbed out of the cockpit. Shilling approached, her hands unsteady. She had developed explosives before. She had altered engines under controlled conditions, but she had never risked a pilot's life on a modification she wasn't officially allowed to make. Davies removed his helmet. He was smiling, an expression rarely seen after a combat patrol. Most pilots returned with haunted eyes, the tension of survival still etched into their faces. Not today. Cooper asked, "Any trouble with the engine, sir?" Davies glanced between Cooper and Shilling. "It's the best the Merlin has ever run," he replied. He explained he had attacked 2 Messerschmitt Bf-109s near Dungeness. His section had taken altitude advantage, and he had pushed forward into a steep 400-mile-per-hour dive, exactly the maneuver that usually caused the engine to quit. But the Merlin ran perfectly, delivering full power throughout the entire attack. He closed to 200 yards before the enemy pilot noticed. A 3-second burst stitched bullets into the Messerschmitt's wing root, forcing the German fighter to brake and flee toward France. Davies climbed back up without the engine hesitating once. For the first time in nearly a year, he had executed a -G diving attack without the terrifying silence of a stalled engine. He demanded to know what maintenance had changed. Shilling told him the truth: the small brass restrictor limiting fuel flow during -G. Davies stared at her in silence for several seconds, then turned to Cooper. "Install that on every Hurricane at this station. Today," he ordered. Shilling reminded him that the modification was unauthorized, but Davies dismissed the concern. Authorization meant nothing if pilots kept dying. Everyone on that airfield had lost friends due to preventable engine failures. If High Command wanted to court-martial him for installing a life-saving adjustment, they could do so after he survived the war. Cooper spent the afternoon installing restrictors in 4 additional Hurricanes. Shilling had brought only 6. 1 she kept for test and measurement purposes. Over the next 3 days, 5 Hurricanes flew combat patrols with the restrictors installed. Not a single engine failed. 12 diving attacks were executed against German fighters, and every time the Merlin continued to deliver power. Some pilots even reported improved performance at higher altitudes. News spread fast. By March 18th, every squadron commander in No. 11 Group had heard about the device and wanted it immediately. Shilling received 14 calls in 2 days. Could she bring more? Could she train their mechanics? How quickly could production scale? That was the real obstacle. She had machined all 6 original restrictors herself at the RAE workshop. Mass production would require suitable brass stock, precision lathes and drills, trained machinists, and proper inspection standards. She needed Air Ministry approval. She needed manufacturing resources. And she needed them urgently. The approval came in only 4 days. The Air Ministry classified her restrictor as a war-winning innovation and ordered it into full production.
Rolls-Royce received the urgent manufacturing order. They were capable of producing around 500 restrictors per week, and installation was to begin without delay at every RAF fighter station. Shilling put together a compact team consisting of 3 fellow engineers from Farnborough and 2 civilian mechanics. They would travel from station to supervise the process. A key advantage of her design was that the restrictor could be installed without removing an aircraft from operational status. Britain could not afford to pull Hurricanes and Spitfires off the front line, not with German fighters still making daily incursions across the Channel. Although the Battle of Britain had officially ended, the air war continued relentlessly. Shilling loaded her tools and boxes of restrictors onto her Norden motorcycle. She knew the route well. She had visited 43 RAF bases before the war began. She knew the station commanders. She knew the mechanics by name. This time, she was returning with a simple piece of brass that would keep their pilots alive. By March 25th, installation teams were mobilized. 600 restrictors had already been produced. 40 stations were scheduled. 3,000 Merlin engines waited for modification. Shilling started her motorcycle and rode toward Biggin Hill. Biggin Hill was the busiest station in No. 11 Group. 32 Spitfires and 21 Hurricanes flying continuous patrols. Shilling arrived at 0800 on March 26th. Group Captain Grice met her personally. He had lost 7 pilots to engine failures in the previous 2 months alone. He demanded installations begin immediately. Ground crews jumped into action, 4 aircraft at a time, working in rotating shifts. Each modification took just 12 minutes. Disconnect the fuel line, insert the restrictor, weld, reconnect, and test for leaks. The welds were critical. A failed weld at altitude could cut off fuel entirely. Shilling supervised every single installation. She inspected every joint, pressure tested every connection, and rejected 3 restrictors that fell short of specifications. Pilots gathered around the maintenance area, keenly interested in the strange little device that promised to solve a problem costing them their friends. Flight Lieutenant James Lacey, a Cambridge engineering graduate with 41 missions behind him, had personally experienced engine failures twice during dogfights. When Shilling explained the physics of the flow chamber and the effects of negative G-forces on fuel flow, he understood instantly and called it brilliantly simple. By March 28th, all 53 Merlin engines at Biggin Hill were equipped with restrictors. Shilling's team moved next to Hornchurch, then to Northweald, then to Tangmere, repeating the intense schedule at each stop. Ground crews worked 12-hour days. Pilots flew their patrols with the new modification. Results were identical everywhere. 0 engine failures. The restrictor functioned perfectly. Pilots began to speak highly of the improvement and of the small brass part responsible. Soon a nickname caught on: Miss Shilling's Orifice. The slightly risque joke, credited to Sir Stanley Hooker of the Rolls-Royce Supercharger Division, spread rapidly. Shilling took no offense. She understood the way fighting men used humor to cope with fear and uncertainty. If a crude nickname helped them trust the device, she was willing to accept it. Pilots began demanding the modification by name. Some even refused to fly until their aircraft had the restrictor installed. Their commanders supported them. Too many fighters had been lost due to preventable stalls in dives. Across the Channel, the Germans noticed. Luftwaffe after-action reports in early April recorded a distinct change in British combat behavior. Spitfires and Hurricanes no longer abandoned attacks after pushing into negative G. Messerschmitt fighters could no longer bait them into engine failures. The technical edge Germany had exploited for nearly a year vanished almost overnight. By mid-April, Shilling's teams had installed restrictors in more than 2,100 Merlin engines, every Hurricane and Spitfire and Fighter Command, every aircraft in training units, and every reserve fighter ready to fly. The modification was officially classified as standard equipment. New Spitfires and Hurricanes rolling out of Castle Bromwich in Southampton arrived with the restrictor already fitted. The pressure carburetor remained under development, with estimated readiness no sooner than 1943. The restrictor worked so well that some engineers questioned whether the costly redesign was still worth pursuing. But Shilling knew the truth. Her restrictor was a stopgap, an ingenious one, but temporary. The pressure carburetor would restore full power under every flight condition without limiting fuel flow. That was the long-term solution. In the meantime, Miss Shilling's Orifice was saving lives, thousands of them. The statistics made the difference undeniable. Fighter Command recorded everything: sorties flown, planes lost, victories claimed. And the numbers told a dramatic story. In March 1941, before the restrictor, RAF fighters experienced catastrophic engine failures in 38% of diving attacks. Pilots frequently had to break off, allowing German fighters to escape or even counterattack. In April 1941, after the restrictor, engine failure rates in dives plunged to 0.4%, essentially eliminated. The few failures that remained were the result of battle damage or unrelated mechanical issues. RAF combat effectiveness surged. In March, Fighter Command had lost 47 Hurricanes and Spitfires while shooting down 61 German aircraft, a fragile 1.3-to-1 ratio.
In April, 29 British fighters were lost, while 94 German aircraft were destroyed, a far more decisive 3.2 to 1 ratio. The restrictor was not the only reason for the improvement, but squadron leaders consistently credited it as one of the major factors. Morale soared as well. Pilots who had previously flinched at the thought of diving on an enemy now attacked boldly, confident that their engines would continue to deliver full power. Pilot Officer Robert Stanford Tuck, flying Spitfires from Duxford, had suffered 4 engine failures before the restrictor was installed. Now, for the first time in months, he trusted his Merlin when diving into combat.
After the installation of the restrictor, he no longer hesitated to dive after enemy fighters. In May, he shot down 3 Messerschmitt Bf-109s, and 2 more fell to his guns in June. He credited his renewed aggressiveness to the restrictor, which gave him the confidence to commit fully to diving attacks without fear that his engine would quit at the worst possible moment. The modifications soon expanded beyond fighter command. RAF Coastal Command requested restrictors for their Bristol Bow fighters. Bomber Command asked for them to be installed on training aircraft to keep novice crews safe. Even the Fleet Air Arm made inquiries about adding the device to carrier-based fighters. Shilling worked closely with Rolls-Royce to scale up production. By June, the factory was turning out nearly 1,000 restrictors every week. The device remained in frontline use well into 1943. Rolls-Royce finally introduced the long-awaited pressure carburetor in January of that year, a design that completely eliminated the negative G fuel starvation problem. It operated on principles similar to fuel injection: no float chamber, no flooding, flawless fuel supply, regardless of maneuvering. But the retrofitting older aircraft with the new carburetor required a major overhaul. The old unit had to be removed, new fuel pumps installed, engine controls rewired and recalibrated. Each conversion grounded a fighter for 8 hours. With squadrons flying combat sorties around the clock, Fighter Command couldn't afford to pull aircraft from the line for that long. As a result, many Hurricanes and Spitfires continued flying with Miss Shilling's Orifice until 1944, some until the very end of the war. Newly built aircraft received the pressure carburetor, but veteran machines retained the restrictor their pilots trusted. Ground crews preferred it as well: easy to service, proven reliable. In wartime, if something worked, it stayed. Shilling then turned to other urgent challenges. She helped develop cold-weather starting systems for aircraft deployed to Iceland and the Soviet Union. She investigated fuel behavior at high altitude. She supported improvements to supercharger performance in late-war Merlin variants. The Royal Aircraft Establishment kept her constantly engaged with new technical problems, each one tied directly to aircrew survival. Still, the restrictor remained the innovation everyone remembered. Engineers around the world studied it as a model of elegant and efficient design under extreme pressure, a straightforward solution, rapidly deployed, producing immediate and quantifiable results. It embodied everything good engineering should strive for. Keith Maddock, a wartime chief engineer at Hangar 42, later said, "Beatrice Shilling helped us win World War II. Of that there can be no doubt. The restrictor was a genuine war-winning invention." Her work, however, did not end there. The RAE continued to rely on her for urgent fixes to life-threatening mechanical issues. Engines struggling at high altitude, carburetors icing in sub-zero temperatures, aircraft refusing to start in Arctic cold. Every new crisis seemed to land on Shilling's desk. For Spitfires operating from Murmansk in the brutal Russian winter of 1941-42, she introduced preheated oil systems and modified fuel mixtures to ensure engines would start even at -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Standard lubricants froze solid, batteries lost charge instantly, and fuel thickened in the lines. Her innovations allowed British fighters to continue escort and patrol missions throughout the winter, something considered nearly impossible before her arrival. She tackled high-altitude performance as well. Late-war Spitfires were fighting at 35,000 feet and above, where the Merlin struggled in thin, oxygen-poor air. The fuel mixture had to be regulated with extreme precision. Too rich and the engine choked, too lean and severe overheating followed.
Shilling developed altitude compensation enhancements that improved power output by roughly 8% above 30,000 feet, a dramatic improvement in air-to-air combat capability. Through all of this, she fiercely protected the boundary between her demanding career and her personal life. She had married George Naylor in September 1938, an aerodynamicist also working at the RAE. When the war began, he volunteered for Bomber Command. He flew Avro Lancasters with 625 Squadron, completing 31 bombing missions over Germany, enough to earn the Distinguished Flying Cross after flying beyond his required tour. Shilling dreaded every night he flew, knowing that bomber crews suffered the highest casualty rates in the RAF. Almost half never returned. Naylor survived and came back to Farnborough in 1944. They rarely spoke about the missions he flew or the engineering crises she confronted. Their marriage and their jobs occupied separate parts of their lives. Shilling also clung to the passion that had shaped her youth, motorcycle racing. Though Brooklands racetrack had been converted into wartime aircraft factories, she continued to ride her Norton at high speed on country roads whenever she could spare a moment. The rush of velocity helped her clear her mind, work through mechanical puzzles that resisted laboratory thinking. Some of her most important insights came to her while leaning into a turn at 90 miles per hour. By 1945, she had contributed to at least 17 major wartime projects: cold weather systems, altitude performance upgrades, carburetor refinements, supercharger improvements, and numerous fuel system breakthroughs. Each one saved lives. Each one helped secure victory.
Every project she tackled kept RAF aircraft operational under punishing conditions, but none ever matched the fame of her restrictor. When World War II ended in Europe in May 1945 and Japan surrendered that August, the Royal Aircraft Establishment shifted from high-pressure wartime innovation to slower-paced peacetime research with entirely different priorities. Shilling remained at Farnborough. There was never any question of her leaving. Engineering defined her life. In 1948, she received formal recognition for her wartime achievements. King George VI appointed her an Officer of the Order of the British Empire. She attended the ceremony at Buckingham Palace in full dress, accepted her medal, posed briefly for photographs, and returned to work the very next morning. She continued solving complex engineering problems for another 21 years, proving again and again that women belonged in technical fields. Yet the restrictor remained the achievement everyone associated with her: the small brass washer that protected Britain's fighter pilots. Shilling worked at the Royal Aircraft Establishment until 1969, completing 33 years of dedicated service. Despite her extraordinary accomplishments, she never reached the highest administrative roles, positions still reserved exclusively for men in that era. She accepted the limitation without complaint. She had always preferred practical engineering to office politics. Real machinery, real failures, real solutions. That was where she excelled. Her post-war assignments included the Blue Streak ballistic missile program, where she contributed to fuel delivery improvements and high-altitude performance. She investigated landing accidents on wet runways. By the 1950s, more aircrew were killed by landing mishaps than by engine failures. Understanding how standing water reduced tire friction allowed her to propose changes that prevented fatalities. She published 3 technical papers on the subject. She even designed a bobsled for the Royal Air Force Olympic team, an unusual task for an aeronautical engineer, yet rooted in the same principles she had mastered for decades: aerodynamics, weight distribution, and friction control. The team competed using her sled. They didn't win medals, but they raced safely to the finish. Shilling retired in 1969, at the age of 60. In retirement, she devoted herself to restoring vintage motorcycles and occasionally raced them in classic events. She maintained her beloved Norton, the same machine she had first rebuilt in 1934, the one that taught her how engines behaved on the limits. She passed away on November 18, 1990, at 81 years old. Her husband George survived her, along with a remarkable legacy of engineering excellence. When newspapers covered her death, they focused almost entirely on the restrictor, Miss Shilling's Orifice.
Decades of other achievements appeared only as footnotes. Yet her impact continued to grow long after her passing. In 2011, a pub in Farnborough was renamed the Tilly Shilling in her honor. In 2015, the Brooklands Museum acquired her racing medals and memorabilia. In 2018, Winchester Heritage recognized her among Hampshire's extraordinary women. In 2019, Royal Holloway University opened the Beatrice Shilling Building for its electronic engineering students. That same year, a commemorative plaque was installed in her birthplace to mark 110 years since her birth. The restrictor itself became a teaching symbol. Engineering students worldwide studied it as the ideal response to a high-stakes failure. A simple, elegant fix delivered quickly to save lives. In museums, some of the original restrictors are displayed in glass cases, small pieces of brass representing the enormous value of creativity under pressure. In telling stories like hers, many hope to ensure that the contributions of engineers who quietly saved lives are not forgotten. Shilling proved that innovation doesn't always require complexity, and that determined individuals can change the course of history with resourcefulness, precision, and courage. Remembering her achievements helps preserve the legacy of those who fought the war not with guns or airplanes, but with insight and the will to solve the impossible.